be able to be here and to participate in this, and to participate in this evening of celebration and remembrance. And for me, as for many here, I suspect the remembrance of a great teacher, poet, literati, wordsmith, indeed an architect of language, a poetic genius with an abiding Jeremiad against injustice. Given Irving Layton's intense biblical image, his powerful resonant voice, his railing against injustice, I remember thinking while I was a student at the time studying the prophet Jeremiah, that Jeremiah must have looked and sounded like Irving Layton. To say that I was a student of Irving Layton is itself an understatement. For Irving Layton was not only my student in one course, literature, not only my student in a set of courses in the humanities, but he taught me in the entire part of the secular studies program at then Herzliya Junior High School, which included also chemistry, physics, and math. The result is that while I learned a great deal about literature and humanities, to this day I know very little about literature, about physics, chemistry, and math. Because when Irving was to be teaching us these courses, he would be rather teaching us Shelley, Wordsworth, Shakespeare, Plato, Marx, and Nietzsche with appropriate criticisms, or read us from his works in progress. And that was one of the great periods of Layton's writing and poetry, then in the 50s, such as Red Carpet in the Sun, which he was reading to us as he was, in fact, writing it in his resonant voice with that unique union of mind, heart, spirit, and passion. Herewith is an excerpt from that poem as alive and, I would say, as resonant today when Irving Layton first wrote those words. They dance best who dance with desire, who lifting feet of fire from fire weave before they lie down a red carpet for the sun. And he was a great teacher, challenging, probing, provocative, evocative, passionate, audacious and inspiring, with a unique and compelling command of words at a time, one would say, when words had meaning and which resonated in his pedagogy as it did in his poetry. Irving Layton seemed to internalize in his psyche, as well as his poetry, the romanticism of Shelley, the pantheism of Wordsworth, the dialectics of Hegel, the questioning of Socrates, questioning whatever was the zeitgeist at the time, railing always against the prevailing conventional wisdom or political correctness, with an abiding passion for justice, or I would say, the combating of injustice. And it was, in fact, learning from Irving at the time that my parents had earlier taught me when I didn't understand the profundity of the lessons at the time. They then came true to me in listening to his words, because it was my father who had taught me the importance of what he called the overriding imperative of pursuing justice, which he said was equal to all the other commandments combined. But it was my mother who would say to me when she heard my father saying this, that if you want to pursue justice, then you have to understand, you have to feel the injustice about you. Otherwise, the pursuit of justice is just a theoretical construct. You have to feel the injustice and combat the injustice. And Irving Layton was not only teaching us, not only sharing his poetry with us, but really also training us for the combating of injustice. And yes, with a sometimes sexual imagery or maddening metaphor that might have caused Shelley to blush, or Wordsworth to disclaim, or the prophets to ask, where is God in all this? Yet Irving, who taught us in the mid-50s, who wrote in the shadow of the Holocaust, who wrote in the shadow and the immediate aftermath of the rebirth of the State of Israel, Irving was always alive to the vulnerability of the powerless, or to the powerlessness of the vulnerable, becoming the voice of the voiceless and the voice of the powerless, and a voice that was at the one and the same time profoundly Jewish, and yet at one and the same time universalistic in his message. and who would put himself on the line with his poetry and his messages. I remember when we were in grade 9, and the parents sought to fire Irving Layton for the manner in which he would put himself on the line. And we as grade 9 students went on strike. And Irving Layton remained, and the parents had to endure him as we loved him. And so it was then that Irving Layton, my teacher, my mentor, my inspiration, became also my colleague and my friend. Our lives intersecting at neuralgic points of our respective being and becoming. We both began teaching at York University at the same time in 1970. And we both left York at the same time to return shortly thereafter to Montreal for reasons as much of aesthetics as anthropology, as Irving described in his poetry, referring to York University at the time as a concrete farm. We joined hands early and often in the struggle for Soviet Jewry, including then Soviet prisoners of conscience Anatoly Sharansky, whom Irving Layton had adopted, and through that adoption gave his case and cause the resonance that only his poetry and advocacy could do. And we would meet not by design but by inclination and intuition in the same haunts and hallways, such as the Brown Derby restaurant or the Jewish public library or the newsstand on the corner of Peel and St. Catherine. It was therefore a most moving moment for me when speaking on the occasion of Irving's 85th birthday in the Centaur Theatre. If some of you were there at the time, again, a very moving evening. Irving said publicly that evening what he had shared with me at the newsstand when we met then together with Harriet Bernstein, and referred to me then, and I say this, I apologize for the conceit in the saying of it, but the meaning that it had for me all my life as his spiritual son. Irving, as some know, developed Alzheimer's in his last years and continued to be comforted and cared for among others by Musia Schwartz, who's here this evening, who was his devoted friend for over 50 years. There never was a time when I came to Maimonides Hospital that Musia Schwartz was not there. And she was really an abiding presence and source. And it was in her presence, and perhaps known only to her, that I experienced my most moving encounter with Irving Layton, and with this, I'll move to a close. Irving, not knowing who I was, but somehow knowing where the mind and spirit came together, and I trying to recall the early days, again feeling that somehow maybe one can penetrate through that haze of Alzheimer's by going back in time. And so would read from Red Carpet in the Sun, which he had read so much to us, and where at one point, making some reference to being a spiritual son, feeling that he was nodding in agreement, or so I felt in my conceit. But Irving was for me at that moment, given all that had come before, all that he had meant to me in my life, standing there in the presence of one who taught me how to think, who taught me how to struggle against injustice, who taught me to use the words of Leonard Cohen, who taught me how to live. At that moment and since, Irving has been for me my spiritual father.